You are now under the power of the technical personnel, and they will turn you off after 15 minutes. No, I'm joking. You have, yeah, it might happen also.
I'll try and stick to my time then as best as possible.
I have given everybody 16 minutes up to now, so we have a very welcome, and I'm very happy that they found you. So now we have 15 minutes from now. You can present. Are you sharing screen with us?
Yes. Let me quickly share my screen.
Get the thing in order before we start the time. Okay. Do you have the screen? Does it have a PowerPoint?
I do. Yeah. Let me quickly just share my screen.
Is the sound okay?
Yeah, the sound is very good, I think. Okay, great.
Okay, can everyone see
that? We see it. Very good. Okay, you have 15 minutes from now.
Oh, perfect. Thanks ever so much. So, first of all, thank you ever so much for inviting me to speak and share a little bit of my research for what I've been doing as part of my PhD and what I've just published a book chapter on recently, actually. So today I'm going to be talking about the title of my paper is Researching Indigenous Rights and Climate Advocacy at Synchronic Distances. So what my paper is basically exploring is how Indigenous activists in Brazil are using live streaming on Instagram to specifically advocate for land, citizenship, and environmental rights in real time. And what I'm kind of exploring is how knowledge is disseminated and translated to distant others, with a specific focus on us as researchers. And this paper specifically focuses on a live stream by the Hunikoing community showing a essential food and distribution program taking place. And the video it's interesting because it portrays both epistemological insights and riffs in terms of the information and subsequent knowledge that can be gained by us as researchers from watching these live streams. And what I'm arguing is that we've got to be sort of reflexive to this live streaming, though live streaming is a very positive affordance for Indigenous activists. So Indigenous activists have been using ICTs to discuss environmental rights and citizenship rights for a long time, and it sits in a wider range of Indigenous people using these technologies for about the last 20 years or so. And communities are more and more connected to the internet, so they're turning to places like Instagram, TikTok, and Kai to kind of film, event, and advocacy campaigns in real time via video. And live streaming has kind of become this kind of pastime with a lot of Indigenous communities in Brazil. And the kind of COVID-19 pandemic kind of meant that as researchers, we kind of had to address these streams as kind of cultural rights-based artifacts. And also the pandemic also afforded us as kind of distant witnesses, like myself, the ability to kind of glimpse into these digital spaces in real time. And I found out that this raised some quite important questions in terms of rights. It's kind of like, how should we be researching live streams from distant communities, and how reliable is the kind of empirical data we can gain from them? So just to kind of provide some context to Brazil really quickly, the situation of land rights reached a low point in the last couple of years with Jair Bolsonaro in office. His government kind of implemented a lot of kind of neo-colonial policies, and that was why a lot of Indigenous people moved to social media to kind of amplify their voices and their struggles and kind of discuss the environment and charity initiatives. And as I said, over the past decade, there's been a massive surge of Indigenous video rights activism across Brazil that's been mobilizing to various degrees. So I suppose in reaction to Bolsonaro, 2022 saw the largest amount of Indigenous candidates voted into office, with the two candidates here on screen, Célia Chacriabá and Sonia Guajajara, voted in as federal deputies, but now Sonia Guajajara, the one on the right with the blue headdress, is now the Indigenous minister in Brazil. And yeah, here I just wanted to make the point that obviously technology has always been a political tool in Brazil for Indigenous people, to kind of, you know, acquisites evidence of human rights abuses, for example. I mean, we can look at the first ever Indigenous politician that was voted into Brazil in 1988. Maria Joana used to carry around a tape deck, for example, to kind of record other politicians' kind of racist conversations about Indigenous Brazilians. And I suppose this kind of racism and criminalization has long been directed at Indigenous groups in Brazil. However, now we kind of can look at video technology as a kind of weapon to provide evidence of those things in real time for what my research focuses on. So recently, the kind of empirical part of my paper is based on a book chapter I just published, where I kind of looked at one of these live streams taking place in real time with an artist and activist called Y, who I've kind of synonymized to kind of protect her identity. Basically, she live streamed over Instagram a food distribution program taking place called the SOS Polvo Honeycombing. And I suppose the live stream was kind of thematic of her holding up a mirror to shine a light on Bolsonaro's government's failings to provide adequate services in the state of Acre in the Amazonas region during the COVID-19 pandemic. Yet for me, witnessing this in a stream, more importantly, it displayed how Indigenous activists can kind of challenge notions of Brazilian citizenship by showing how kind of communities can independently organize and organize distribution programs and then kind of market them during these live stream video interactions. Or so I originally thought, right? So to quickly just provide some context to the Honeycombing, they reside in the westernmost part of the Brazilian Amazon in the state of Acre on the Peruvian border. It's a really remote region called the Caxanaya. And also it's quite nice. I like to always mention here when I'm kind of delivering this specific case study that live streaming and kind of live video fit quite nicely into the kind of anthropological perspective of their cosmology, because they have a word in the Pano language family that's literally a chucu-chucué. And I suppose it translates into Portuguese as a vida é. And I suppose in English, that is kind of life is. Life wasn't, life won't be, life is present in this moment. It's ephemeral, it's here in this space. And I suppose in many ways, that's kind of like live streaming in many ways in terms of we have to be present in that time and space. But I always like to highlight that, just a little side note from that. But I don't want to delve into that. I'd rather talk about the thematic content in this live stream pertaining to rights issues, right? So this live stream, some of the content of it was because of the remoteness of the community. They do have some internet access via satellite, but some of this the remoteness of it means they're susceptible to the elements of Mother Nature, right? And the community in 2022 experienced quite intense flooding, right? So what these pictures are showing here is that they kind of independently organized this basically a food distribution program to distribute care packages to local members of the community. And what Y was saying is that she wanted her voice to be heard by the outside world. And basically what I'm going to talk about is how I looked at that subsequently, right? So then it comes to myself about how I was witnessing this in terms of being a human rights researcher. Like, how do we listen to these voices that we're seeing in evidence in real time? So basically how the investigation into how knowledge is transferred through live stream video and through the kind of idea of video data analysis and critical autoethnography as a kind of methodology, right? Now, I suppose in this paper, I looked at ethnography as being kind of an all-encompassing phenomena that encircles both the digital and physical field sites. That I suppose is kind of now a totalizing environment for research. And again, after the COVID-19 pandemic, it kind of pushed researchers to discover and explore more methods of conducting these studies, you know, both digitally with custom-made video and ready-made video live stream research. So I suppose what I'm arguing here is that as a rights researcher, qualitative kind of critical autoethnography with kind of video data analysis was a kind of suitable methodology to examine live streams as kind of digital artifacts of evidence, because a kind of critical self-reflections can be drawn from the kind of online interaction and allow us to kind of contemplate what knowledge was disseminated through the kind of act of us witnessing, for example, whether it be distant and mediated, for example. Now, ethnography isn't reinventing the wheel here. I mean, it's been used extensively in the kind of rights research on video activism, for example. Therefore, I thought it was important to kind of implement kind of critical autoethnography to have these kind of introspective questions being answered as well. and I thought it also opened an interesting ontological space because obviously I'm a Western male from an urban setting rather than an Indigenous female activist from the Brazilian Amazon, right? And it's virtually so the kind of I suppose this kind of builds to kind of Claire Land's example here. She wrote an amazing book called Decolonizing Solidarity, where she talks a lot about kind of turning that lens on ourselves a little bit in order to kind of extrapolate how normatively how we perform that kind of solidarity, right? And she's arguing that like non-Indigenous activists and researchers such as ourselves should kind of participate in Indigenous solidarity and research from a kind of self-critical stance, which is especially true of autoethnography because it isn't kind of on the ground with research participants, which can lead to other epistemological conundrums, such as Hunter's example of the idea of being there. So I suppose, therefore, autoethnography and live reflection and kind of note-taking allows kind of non-Indigenous research to kind of critically reflect and engage at a distance surrounding kind of introspective questions such as, where did I witness the live stream? What was I doing during the live stream? And kind of how did it make me feel, for example? And this, in a way, I found, and this is why I published the chapter on it, it can kind of equilibralize the practice of witnessing, right? So by adopting a kind of iterative research process of identifying the kind of social media accounts to build a case around kind of setting notifications on the platforms to build a pattern of when various individuals kind of tend to go live, there are generally two different methods for constructing this kind of research. So the first one I found was you can kind of adopt a specific research hours for witnessing these live streams in a kind of comfortable workspace or computer or a phone kind of ready to capture these via a screen recorder, for example, with obviously with the prior consent of the participant, and kind of take notes. But however, for kind of live exploration into kind of Indigenous research and conducted by kind of a non-Indigenous person, this method can kind of set out a kind of asymmetrical power dynamic between the kind of researcher and the participant. For example, I mean, I could have been making value judgments pertaining to the parameters of sort of say when said research might take place, or what live stream or what piece of evidence might be more important than another, right, without entering into that video, for example. So instead, I kind of used this method, which hasn't really been, at least I found, hasn't really been written about or hasn't really been looked at as much as it probably should be. So instead, I argued that it should be the kind of duty of, for me, for example, as a non-Indigenous rights researcher, to kind of take a more all-encompassing stance to the kind of idea of witnessing human rights live streams as soon as they go live, regardless of kind of a distant distance or physical space. And this can kind of equilibralize the terms of distant witnessing, right, and research engagement towards Indigenous communities by kind of placing the power solely in the hands of the streamers, right, by kind of allowing them to decide the kind of terms of engagement of that research, and thus kind of situating the researcher as somewhat kind of secondary. Because in regards to, especially with Indigenous populations and some marginalized populations, we know too well that often researchers have kind of dictated the kind of terms of engagement with them. But yet the kind of technology and study of live streaming can kind of turn that on its head because of the kind of technology's spontaneity and ephemerality. So basically it can turn that power dynamic on its head. Though I do have to mention, yeah, as a researcher, it needs to, you do need to keep your kind of mental health in check. So again, this speaks more broadly to kind of Claire Land's argument in Decolonizing Solidarity about surrounding the practice of how we look at our kind of comfortable privilege that some researchers might experience with when being able to kind of reflect upon in how Indigenous data is transmitted. And I just want to quickly say that these are the best images I could have found here for these couples. I know they look these are not the best images, but I was trying to figure out how to make this slide a bit more visually, aesthetically engaging. But yeah, those are the images I could kind of find for that. So just quickly, the kind of conclusion to what I came up with from what I found from this empirical case, though, and which I published in the chapter, which I can send to anyone if you email me afterwards. I'll be more than happy to send it through. Was that considering this discussion about how live stream research is important to kind of mention in all of this methodology as distant witnesses and researchers, all of the information that initially comes out in live streams isn't always there. Now, fortunately, Y turned our on-demand settings on, and I was able to reflect on the live stream later. But basically, I found this image, which meant that the project wasn't entirely self-funded by the community. It did have help from the Brazilian government and the Bank of Brazil. And this was on the on-demand image. So my theoretical analysis saying that Bolsonaro's government have like completely failed to address some of the issues in that community didn't really make sense in terms of this empirical analysis. Though his government did fail on a lot of things in terms of rights. But basically what I wanted to get at here was that even though we might be witnessing these streams initially, we have to triangulate them and figure out methods of trying to capture them in order to, you know, basically gain evidence of possible human rights abuses. I know I've just come up to about the 15 minutes, so I'll sort of stop it there. I'll just finish by saying that our research into kind of live streamed Indigenous rights should be kind of understood as witnessing, as it kind of allows us as kind of practice researchers to kind of provide testimony as a form of solidarity. And I would say that it's kind of an ethical responsibility to kind of articulate that as researchers, we're kind of sharing space with Indigenous causes like the Hunikoings, and showing basically sharing solidarity by researching their kind of territorial struggles a lot of time. And I suppose in some instances, all our impact could be is transferring knowledge within kind of maybe these academic circles or policy circles. But it should be our responsibility to provide our kind of research to human rights stuff as testimony in some knowledge transfer capacity, be it kind of a policy paper, book chapter, policy report, conference lecture, whatever that kind of be. Where it should be. But however, we should be very careful to always do it via maybe Zoom like this is, or a live stream, because sometimes the information in the initial stream might drop or our connection might drop. So we've got to figure out ways to kind of capture these things in order to, you know, preserve what could be human rights evidence, I suppose. I suppose that's my main takeaway from the chapter, I guess, just to kind of leave it there, if that makes sense. But yeah, thank you ever so much for letting me talk. And I'm sorry if I've had to rattle through that to get it in under the full sort of 15, 16 minute mark.
Thank you very much. You were excellent.
Oh, thank you.
It's very interesting. I want to link you. I heard you were lost in cyberspace or in some other session before, but our first presenter, Margarita, wasn't it you talking about being welcome to the lands and how it changed? How is this space issue when you're doing live streaming between the researcher? Because I wanted to link to you when I was in Australia and in New Zealand several years ago, when we went on fieldwork, we were always welcome to the lands, and it was made obvious that the people welcoming us, they were possibly the stewards, but something else, but the lands were there, the space of the lands. It was not necessarily their space and so. So how does this kind of territoriality or this space issue translate? I'm sorry, I'm abusing now because I find this very interesting. How does this translate into your research?
That's an amazing question. It's something I can answer quite quickly as well, actually. So my PhD at the moment at the University of Cambridge looks at how live streaming creates knowledge about Indigenous rights for non-Indigenous people, right? And basically, I found out that it doesn't, right? Because your question, well, it doesn't to a certain degree overall, right? Because it needs to be physically triangulated, right? You can't construct the knowledge without being in that space, right? To a certain degree, right? But it reminds me of what you said. I mean, the Maori scholar, actually, talking about, you mentioned New Zealand, Australia, the Maori scholar, Linda Smith, famously talks a lot about this idea of in Takoa Maori, of kanoe kitea, the seen face, right? Now, what live streaming, this research into live streaming for me at a distance, actually meant that my seen face basically meant that some of the Indigenous people on the ground, when I went to do field work with participant observation in Brazil, they already kind of knew me and they knew who I was, and they were able to basically trust me and say, this is Tom, he's been researching and speaking to us at a distance this whole time, and now he's physically here. But I do think that there's only a short bandwidth of knowledge that you can really tap into just from these live streams. But I do think it's important to we should be looking at these ephemeral live streams in terms of how we should be capturing it, and we should be placing a kind of normative emphasis in terms of human rights on these live streams as well. Because that's obviously something that can happen at a distance. I mean, obviously a lot of Indigenous rights and visual evidence is a lot safer to capture these things in Europe, for example, rather than being on the ground in Brazil, where there's a lot of human rights violations pertaining to land and things for various other different reasons. That would probably be out of scope for me to talk to today. But I mean, yeah, there's only a limited amount of bandwidth that you can get from being at a distance, but it's still a good it's a good throughput in order to enter into these territorial spaces and to build trust with a lot of these communities on the ground. There's a balance there. Yeah,
very interesting. Okay, sorry about this. Please, everybody else, questions? Yes, please. Could you say
Nina? Sorry,
Nina. Yeah, and then Nina, I have not this kind of.
No, that's
I have a clock.
Tom, nice to see you. We chatted a few months back. I hope you can
Hey.
hear me. Yeah.
Oh, hi, Nina. Hi, how are you?
Great. It's great to see you. Yeah, I think I might have even told you about this conference, so I might be the.
Yeah.
Oh, very good, very good. We should thank you.
Yeah. I wondered if you can clarify a bit more about the audience. Like, who were they trying to get to listen to them? How much did it spread? And what's the context of this kind of use of video? I mean, you talk about it in the context of this particular group, but I just want to pull you back to give us a bit more of a big picture for those of us who might not know so much.
It's a great question. That's an amazing question. This is a really weird case example, actually. So this was originally meant, I'm going to use a word that's not really used that much, and it's quite difficult to define, but it was meant as a narrowcast, right? So it was meant specifically to people that were in that area of the Kissock-Mamede that had the ability to donate via this. So Brazil has this payment system that only Brazilians can access called PIX. And you need your kind of national identity card to kind of wire this money, right? So it wasn't meant for the kind of international community. Now this live stream was meant very much as a narrowcast for like the community that had been affected and the local areas that could have donated to the Sister Básica program. But weirdly enough, what happened was as Wired kind of turned on her on-demand settings, it just kind of snowballed, right? It ended up, when I wrote the paper last year, it ended up with, I think it had like something like 12,000 views or something. And that community is literally, I think there's only a couple of thousand people. It's a really, really remote part of the Amazon, right? It's literally on the border of Peru and Brazil. And it had, I think the numbers were around 11 or 12,000 views on that video. So yeah, I mean, initially when I spoke to her, the audience was meant as just people that were in the region near the River Jordão that was completely flooded. But they were saying that it can just completely snowballed after that because they turned on the on-demand settings, and the algorithm on Instagram was able to pick it up and snowball it, I suppose. So it kind of went from being this kind of narrowcast into a more broadcast thing. Yeah, so I don't know if that kind of answers your question, Nina, in that respect. The intentionality was as a narrowcast, but it sort of unintentionally became a broadcast, if you see what I mean, post haste. Very
interesting. Okay, any other questions? Yeah, Nancy.
Our question here is, hi, nice to meet you. It's very interesting, and I also found in my own work with leaders in several countries across Latin America and now Canada, very used to use this type of mainstreaming and all that. But I wonder if your focus is like doing it through this very specific mean and not really including others. You now added like observation and others, which kind of responded to my question, but I wonder if you discuss in your work how what you see is mediated by the eye of the one who is filming. You know what I mean? Because when I did my work, I kind of saw the bit that was mainstream. And then when I went for the interviews and all the other things, then the whole other world unpacked, I don't know if you have discussed that and how you see that.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So yeah, it's a really good point. And this is what I kind of mean by the kind of physical triangulation thing, right? So for me, what I found in terms of in the whole human right, the whole kind of idea of witnessing and human rights toolkit is like live streaming just fits in as a tool in a wider ecosystem of human rights tools for in terms of visual evidence, right? So when I was actually conducting a lot of my interviews like on the ground in Brazil, I was getting the same thing. It was saying that live streaming just kind of fits in with some of those things. And it's a tool that can be quite useful in terms of, say, things that are happening in real time. So again, a lot of the time it's not used as kind of visual evidence. Things is used as demonstrations and protests and things like that. And then subsequently, it's, I mean, if there's, say for example, there was a demonstration that was in Bahia recently, and the police were using the way they were firing some of the guns, they were kind of breaking international law, and obviously live streaming was able to capture that because initially it was filming the demonstration taking place, but then as the videos came out on some of the live streams, that we could see that the police were using I'm not expert on the kind of international laws of how you do crowd dispersal, but there was something to do with the way the guns were being fired, the kind of tear canisters were being fired at the wrong angles, for example, and the live streamers were able to pick up that. But I suppose, yeah, it is definitely mediated, and it's always kind of mediated through this idea of technology as well, and distance, and even language to a certain extent as well. So yeah, I think when I was running my interviews, a lot of the participants just said that it sits in a whole toolkit of affordances, I suppose, if that answers your question.
Okay. Any other questions? Comments? How may I ask one question only? We had one presentation from Devika here that was talking about the security issues very much in India. How is it with this? I have to tell you, I've been 15 years in China, and if I may say so, I know websites that are alive in China, if they ever are alive, for 96 seconds before they are closed down by the authorities if the wrong thing is said. And in this Brazilian, is this a problem for those doing this live streaming, that they can be for demonstrations or whatever? I don't know the situation.
That's a good point. You raise a good point. It's actually Brazil. I personally haven't come across a lot of this kind of idea of censorship in Brazil.
Yeah, censorship.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's it. I know it definitely exists with the Advocacy, for example, and in China as well. There have been instances where Brazil will do things like shut down WhatsApp for various things, but that's more to do with like political issues, and they kind of use the trope of the kind of national security concern a lot of the time. But what I would say is the main issue in Brazil, especially in terms of indigenous activism, is connectivity, right? So a lot of these remote regions, they're having to rely on things like kind of Starlink and Elon Musk, and obviously they're having to go into contracts with these things, which cause other kind of complications in terms of who owns the internet, for example. But I think connectivity is probably the bigger issue rather than actually the kind of government censorship issue in Brazil. Actually, that's what I find anyway. But yeah, it's a good point. I haven't actually seen it in terms of censoring Indigenous activists. A lot of it is to do with kind of connectivity, I think, is the main issue. And I think sometimes there's actually even a government policy to kind of not prioritize some sort of those connectivity infrastructure projects in various regions. A lot of the time, the government, I think, are quite happy to rely on people like Starlink and Elon Musk just to kind of go into these places, or other kind of providers to go into these places. And we know that these kind of companies also sell to kind of illegal miners and illicit economies as well. And I think sometimes the government are quite happy to perhaps turn a blind eye to some of these things sometimes in regards to them not having to have the responsibility to provide sort of connectivity issues. But on the whole, I haven't seen that much happening in terms of censorship in Brazil, actually. Yeah, if that's, I think that's, yeah, I do tend to, yeah, I think that's something you tend to see in places like China and stuff like that, actually. Yeah. Yeah, but I don't know if that's also an issue for the Advocacy in India, for example, as well as the idea of connectivity and things like that, because I know that they're quite, in some respects, quite remote regions of India as well. Yeah.
That's what I understand. Yes, having been in those particularly close to the big mountains, those regions are very remote. Nothing, flat land is 45 degrees, basically, where you are doing field work in China, at least. And I think in the end, where you come up there, it's very, very, very difficult, very difficult. And these ways would be very good, actually, for people to get in contact. Any other questions here? No? Okay, thank you very much, Tom. I hope you I hope you want to stay with us so you don't slip away somewhere. We don't know. We can stop you, but I don't think we can keep you. That's the problem. It's a willingness. We promise to be a little bit kind, at least in the future.